This is Richard Wolff. Let me be blunt. What happened in Ottawa today wasn't just another press conference. It was a breakup. And the X is Donald Trump's America. For 40 years, Canada was told the same fairy tale. Stay close to Washington. Obey the rules of the U.S. market. Swallow every tariff, every insult, and in return, you'll get stability. Under Trump, that stability turned into blackmail. One tweet in the middle of the night and billions in Canadian exports were suddenly treated like a threat. One signature from the White House and an entire province's economy was turned into collateral damage. So when Prime Minister Mark Carney walked into that room and said, in effect, we don't ask permission anymore, it hit like a shockwave. Not because the numbers were new, but because the posture was. For years, Canadian leaders reacted to Trump. Today, Carney rejected him. He called it a declaration of economic independence, not a slogan, not a campaign line, a structural pivot away from dependence on a president who treats allies like hostages and trade agreements like reality TV props. Under Trump, Canada's forestry exports, aluminum, steel, and manufactured goods, were dangled over a cliff every election cycle so he could look tough on TV. Millions of Canadian jobs were reduced to background extras in Trump's re-election show. Carney's answer begins with something that sounds boring and technocratic. It isn't. Build Canada homes. On paper, it's a housing program. In reality, it's an economic weapon. He is using federal land, public financing, and factory-built housing to do three things at once: slash construction times by 50%, cut costs by 20%, and pull tens of billions of dollars of demand back inside Canada's own borders. Every modular wall, every window, every heat pump is a statement that money will circulate here, not disappear into a supply chain designed in Washington and priced in Trump's tantrums. For decades, Canadian governments waited for foreign investment to trickle in and for American demand to lift all boats. Under Trump, those boats were deliberately rocked. Softwood lumber, punished. Aluminum, tariffed. Autos, threatened. The message from Washington was clear. Canada could be humiliated on live television whenever it suited the optics of America first. Carney's response is the opposite of begging for better treatment. He is rewiring the system. Build Canada Homes is projected on his numbers to support up to 2 million new units over a decade, leverage more than $200 billion in construction and supply contracts, and create or sustain over 800,000 jobs in design, manufacturing, logistics, and skilled trades. Whether those figures turn out exact or not misses the point. The real shock is where the demand is aimed, not at pleasing Trump's White House, at insulating Canada from it. And then came the move that really stung Washington. By Canadian, by default, no more polite language about best efforts. No more pretending that American suppliers are somehow neutral players, while their president calls your industry cheaters and your workers a problem. Carney is flipping the script. From now on, when the federal government spends $1 on housing, rail, defense, or clean energy, the default choice is Canadian firms, Canadian workers, Canadian technology. Think about what that means in practice. A high-speed rail project that might once have gone to a U.S. conglomerate now locks in contracts for Canadian manufacturers in Quebec and Ontario. A public housing bill that used to import prefab units from across the border now orders them from new factories in Manitoba and British Columbia. Timber from New Brunswick isn't just begging for access to U.S. markets. It's feeding a domestic building boom calibrated to Canadian needs, not American politics. Trump's trade policy has been described as radically different. Carney didn't disagree. He agreed and then used that very phrase as justification to break away. Trump changed the rules to make the U.S. less predictable, more punitive, and openly transactional. Canada, under Carney, is changing its rules to make itself less vulnerable, more self-sufficient, and openly unapologetic. For Trump, nationalism is a performance. Rage at rallies, flags on stage, tariffs as theater. For Carney, patriotism today looked like spreadsheets and procurement rules. Less dramatic, maybe, but far more dangerous for Trump's leverage. Because once a country builds its own housing industry, its own energy systems, its own infrastructure backbone, the power of tariffs and threats starts to evaporate. Carney reminded Canadians of something Trump never understood about his own neighbors. This is a country built by risk takers, not sidekicks. Indigenous nations who ran continental trade networks long before Washington existed, immigrant workers who laid track, built ports, dug mines, and kept the lights on in every resource town Trump's advisors can't even spell. That history has been weaponized for decades as a reason to be good team players in the American orbit. Today it was reclaimed as justification to walk out of that orbit. While Trump sells greatness with hats and slogans, Carney is trying to sell something harder: quiet, structural power. Not the kind that makes noise at a rally, but the kind that shows up in a paycheck, in a construction site, in a factory that doesn't close when a U.S. president wakes up angry. One politics thrives on chaos and dependency. The other is trying finally to retire both. In a world where Trump turned even allies into bargaining chips, Carney's declaration is more than a Canadian story. It's a warning shot to every leader still clinging to Washington's shadow and calling it strategy. Because here's the part most headlines won't spell out. Trump didn't just attack Canada with tariffs. He attacked Canadian workers with uncertainty. Ask anyone in the forestry sector in New Brunswick. For years, 75% of their exports went straight to the United States. That's not a trade relationship, that's a choke point. Under Trump, that choke point tightened every time it was politically convenient. One softwood lumber dispute here, one new tariff there, and suddenly billions in value were hanging on the whim of a president who treated cross-border trade like a personal feud. Carney didn't sugarcoat it. He said it clearly. The U.S. is trying to shut out Canadian forestry products, not by accident, by design. Trump's America First morphed into everyone else last, and Canada found itself at the front of that line. That is what dependence looks like in the real world. Not theory, not ideology, but mill closures, reduced shifts, and families staring at mortgage payments tied to a president they didn't vote for and can't remove. So when Carney stands there and lays out $1 trillion investment plan, it's not some abstract macroeconomic experiment. It's a survival strategy. Approximately $1 trillion over a decade into housing, infrastructure, clean energy, AI, and advanced manufacturing isn't just stimulus. It's a shield against the next tweet, the next tariff, the next round of negotiations that feel more like a shakedown than a partnership. Compare the logic. Trump's vision is simple and brutal. Weaponize access to the U.S. market. Use tariffs as a club. Tell allies, if you don't bend, we hit your exports. That's how you get Canadian lumber treated like a national security threat, while billionaire donors get tax breaks and defense contractors get blank checks. The workers always pay. The tariff line on the spreadsheet doesn't show the bankruptcy, the anxiety, the depression. But those are the real interest payments on Trump's trade games. Carney's approach flips the question. What if the jobs, the factories, the contracts don't need to depend on U.S. goodwill at all? What if Canada can create its own internal demand strong enough to keep people employed even when Washington slams the door. Build Canada Homes is just one pillar. Tied to it are rail projects expected to generate tens of thousands of engineering and construction jobs, clean energy projects projected to cut national emissions by double digits, and manufacturing incentives designed to keep high-tech production north of the border instead of watching it drift south for subsidies or proximity. And then there's the Buy Canadian default rule. This is where Trump's crowd gets really uncomfortable because it exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of America first. Washington has no problem demanding public money be spent on U.S. goods. Buy American has been a staple talking point for decades. But the moment Canada mirrors that logic, saying federal agencies, crown corporations, and major projects must choose Canadian suppliers first, the same people who cheered Trump suddenly discover free trade again. Under the new rules, when the federal government buys lumber for public housing, steel for rail lines, or components for defense equipment, the first question is no longer what's cheapest in the US, it's who can deliver in Canada. That one shift turns every major project into a multiplier for domestic jobs. A $10 billion rail line no longer just connects cities, it anchors procurement that keeps factories humming in multiple provinces. A $5 billion housing initiative becomes a pipeline of orders for Canadian window manufacturers, insulation producers, HVAC firms, and modular builders. This is where the contrast with Trump becomes impossible to ignore. While Trump used trade to humiliate allies and feed his base a steady diet of televised grudges, Carney is using it to disentangle Canada from that psychological and economic trap. Trump's tariffs were a reminder he could hurt you whenever it suited him. Carney's declaration is a counter reminder. He doesn't get to decide your future unless you let him. Think about the message this sends to a mill town in New Brunswick or a machine shop in Ontario that's watched order books rise and fall with every headline out of Washington. For years, workers there were told to be patient, to trust the process, to wait while Ottawa filed complaints at the WTO or pleaded for exemptions. Under Trump, those complaints went nowhere and those exemptions came with strings. The people paying the price were the ones who woke up at 4 a.m. for shifts that might not exist next quarter. Now they're hearing something different, that the federal government is prepared to back domestic production with real money, not just speeches, that $1 trillion isn't going into abstract investor confidence, but into physical things, homes, tracks, turbines, data centers that have to be built somewhere by someone with materials sourced from a real place. Carney is betting that place doesn't need to be Trump's America. Of course, the risks are enormous. If the plan fails, critics will call it overreach, point to the debt, and argue Canada should have stayed in its old role. Quiet junior partner, permanent rule follower, forever grateful for market access. But here's the uncomfortable truth for Trump's defenders. That old role was already collapsing. U.S. trade policy under Trump shredded the illusion of a rules-based order. You can't preach loyalty and stability when you've turned your biggest trade partners into props in your next campaign speech. What Carney understood and what he said out loud is that clinging to dependency in the face of radical change is not prudence, it's denial. The United States under Trump changed the rules. Canada can either pretend that didn't happen or redraw its own. Today's declaration was the moment one country finally admitted on camera that it would rather take the risk of standing on its own feet than the certainty of kneeling inside someone else's tantrum. Trump built a politics where other nations' pain became his leverage. Carney is trying to build an economy where that leverage stops working, not with anger, not with insults, but with something far more threatening to a bully, independence that no longer flinches. There's a detail buried beneath all the noise, one that exposes the true consequence of Trump's economic intimidation, the collapse of long-term planning. Not just for governments, but for workers, unions, small manufacturers, and entire regions that depend on predictable cross-border flows. Under Trump, predictability died, investments stalled, executives froze capital spending. Small businesses refused to expand because no one knew when the next tariff would hit or which industry would be sacrificed for Trump's political theatrics. Carney's declaration is, above all, an antidote to that paralysis. He isn't just redirecting procurement, he's constructing a timeline 10, 15, 20 years immune to the turbulence of U.S. politics. That's something the Trump era never understood. Economies don't thrive on adrenaline, they thrive on stability. Workers can't make life decisions, mortgages, retirement, education when a president uses trade policy like a chainsaw. And this is where Canada's shift becomes a case study in how to escape an economic hostage situation. When Carney talks about turning public land into productive assets, he's confronting decades of timid governance. For years, successive governments refused to use federal land aggressively because they were terrified of distorting markets. Meanwhile, Trump distorted entire continents with tariffs announced on Twitter at 2 a.m. Carney's strategy is the opposite. If you want affordability, you build. If you want resilience, you invest. If you want sovereignty, you manufacture. There is no waiting for trickle-down miracles from a partner who has proven repeatedly that your prosperity is expendable whenever it suits his narrative. Look at the numbers. Analysts estimate that a Canadian domestic building ecosystem not dependent on U.S. lumber cycles, U.S. mortgage fluctuations, or U.S. supply chain chokeholds could stabilize housing costs by 12-18% over a decade. Pair that with rail electrification projected to reduce imported fuel spending by billions annually, and you're looking at a structural rebalancing Trump's trade advisors failed to anticipate. This isn't an argument about nationalism, it's an argument about sanity. Trump ran an economy like a casino, high-risk bets, sudden shocks, public humiliation as bargaining chips. Carney is replacing that with industrial planning rooted in math, not mood swings. And that's why Washington is nervous, because if Canada succeeds, it proves that the real danger wasn't abandoning the U.S. orbit. The danger was staying in it. Underneath Carney's trillion-dollar pivot lies a deeper geopolitical truth, one that Trump's administration never grasped. Power doesn't come from threats, it comes from alternatives. And today, for the first time in modern history, Canada showed it has one. Trump's worldview depends on a single assumption, that allies have no choice, that they must accept U.S. tariffs, U.S. delays, U.S. demands, and U.S. contradictions because there is nowhere else to go. Carney shattered that assumption publicly. When he spoke about diversifying markets, expanding forest product transformation, and negotiating trade from a position of autonomy, he wasn't just answering a journalist. He was sending a message to global investors. The U.S. is no longer Canada's gravitational center, and the markets noticed. Early estimates suggest that Canada's infrastructure and clean energy sectors could attract an additional $8,120 billion in private capital precisely because the government is anchoring long-term certainty. Those aren't subsidies. Those are confidence signals, the very thing Trump eroded with every tariff he weaponized. Even the Buy Canadian rule, portrayed by critics as protectionist, is in reality an economic firewall. The United States used procurement nationalism for decades while preaching free markets to everyone else. Canada finally called the bluff. If Buy American was patriotic, then Buy Canadian is equally legitimate. The difference is that Canada is deploying it not as a weapon, but as insulation. And here's the twist. Trump loyalists will hate most. Carney's blueprint could become the international model for how to survive an unstable superpower. Countries across Europe, Asia, and Latin America have already been exploring similar autonomy frameworks after years of whiplash from Trump-style policymaking. Canada may have just become the first to operationalize it. This is what Trump miscalculated. You can bully a partner once, you can bully them twice. But when you bully them for years, you don't get compliance, you get reinvention. Today, Canada chose reinvention, not as revenge, as protection. Carney's final remark captured the shift with surgical clarity. Less time talking about what Americans might do, more time building what Canadians will do. That is not defiance, that is maturity. And it's something Trump, for all his noise, never demonstrated, not domestically, not internationally. The most powerful moment wasn't the $1 trillion number or the procurement overhaul or even the Declaration of Independence. It was the look in Carney's eyes when he said, without theatrics, we control our future. Because in that instant, an entire country stepped out of the frame Trump had forced it into for years. And the world saw what it looks like when a nation stops being afraid of America, not the America of its people, but the America Trump tried to build. One where loyalty is demanded, punishment is random, and stability is extinct. Canada walked away from that game today. And that single act may be the beginning of the post-Trump world order, not because the U.S. declined, but because someone finally refused to be diminished by it